The origins of whisky are obscure, which makes it a little bit difficult to say what the early history of whisky is. Where was it first made? We don't know. Who was the first distiller? We don't know. What did the first whisky taste like? Sorry guys, we don't know. Which means there's an element of creativity, shall we say, when we begin to talk about those early days of distillation and making whisky. What we can say for a fact is that Arabic scholars in the 8th and 9th centuries had perfected the art of distillation, not necessarily for making spirit, but for producing medicines. Distillation was part of a general exploration of science. Alchemy evolved into what we now know as chemistry. And one of the things that they distilled was wine. If you look at Arabic poetry of the 8th century, and I know I love nothing more than curling up at night with a book of Arabic poetry from the 8th century, you will see references to distilled wine taking place. Because if you distilled wine and you added the curative herbs and the curative roots that you already knew would benefit people who were ill, and then you boiled them up with wine and you distilled that wine, what you end up with is something infinitely more powerful, infinitely more efficacious, something that would in fact cure you. So medicine is our starting point. What is now Iraq, what is now Syria, is our starting point. And then the knowledge spreads with the Islamic takeover of North Africa and into southern Europe, into Spain, into Sicily, etc. And at this point, the knowledge begins to be disseminated throughout Europe because these texts are translated from Arabic into Latin by people such as Michael Scott, the first Scotsman to mention distillation. So the knowledge of distillation spreads throughout Europe. This is in the 13th into the 14th century. And it is used initially as a medicine, as it was back in Arabia. But slowly, over the centuries, the use of whisky begins to change because people are drinking that medicine and going, you know what, it makes me feel better and it makes me feel a bit funny at the same time. Hey! So its social use changes from just being something that you took when you were ill to something that you took to celebrate life, something to share with your friends. So this use of whisky begins to change. And all the way right up to the 18th century, you begin to see whisky as becoming part of the culture. In that 18th century, in Scotland and in Ireland, what you're also seeing is the beginnings of mass emigrations, some forced, some voluntary, from Scotland and Ireland across the Atlantic to Canada and America. Now, one thing that you should always know about distillation is that distillers always use what grows around them. So if you're in France, you have grapes, so you make brandy. If you're in Mexico, you have agave, so you make tequila. If you're in the Caribbean, you have cane, so you make rum. If you are growing cereal crops around you, you're going to make whisky. So these Scots and Irish immigrants move across the Atlantic in the 1800s and establish distilleries in America. So in America, instead of using barley, which they were using in Ireland and Scotland, they're going to be using corn because that is a native grain. And the American industry begins to grow. Rye was also grown in America. And that's why in Canada and America, rye whisky begins to evolve. In the 19th century, what you see is a fundamental change in whisky because rather than it just being made for local consumption in the town, in the village, maybe just in the house, you begin to see the idea of brands evolving, particularly towards the tail end of the 19th century. Some of the first great brands in the world were whisky brands. You think of Dewar's, of Johnnie Walker, of Chivas, of the Beams. People of the Jamesons. Here's a great example. John Jameson, taking their name and putting on the bottle as a sign of quality, as a guarantee of quality. My word is my bond. It is guaranteeing that this whisky is good. That was a fundamental shift because then at the tail end of the 19th century you see whisky not just being restricted to the markets in which it was created, but spreading throughout the world. 20th century, well, things get a little bit rocky. You've got Prohibition in America, where the American industry shuts down. The Scots took advantage of that by allowing it casually to be smuggled across the border. We don't really talk about that. But after the Second World War, whisky becomes once again a signifier of success. You think of Mad Men, you think of all the gangster movies. What are people sitting down and drinking? They're drinking whisky. They're drinking Scotch. Because Scotch, let's face it, by the 1960s, was really the only man standing for various reasons. Prohibition had closed down the American industry. It was starting up again. Independence had put paid to Irish exports. It was only beginning to start up again. Scotch was ruling the roost. And so it did, globally, right up until the 1970s into the 1980s, when a new generation of drinkers went, you know what, I fancy something else. And they began to turn their back on the blended whisky, which was the basis of the Scotch's success. But whisky is a very resilient category. Whisky always finds a new way of getting itself out of tricky situations. One way it always gets itself out of tricky situations is by looking closely at the flavour and, if necessary, adjusting the flavour to suit the changing palate. You saw this in the mid-19th century when blended Scotch whisky first evolved. It was to compete with the great Irish whiskies, a lighter style. You saw it happening during Prohibition, where the American palate went extremely light because they wanted to detect what was a bit dodgy and potentially poisonous and made in bathtubs. So you get very light brands being created in the 1930s, such as Chivas Regal, Cutty Sark, J&B. And then in the 1980s, what you begin to see is the palate has changed again. People are looking for bigger flavours all of a sudden. The lightness which has gone on all the way from the 1930s right up through the 1960s and onwards is changing. People are looking for bigger and bolder flavours, just as they did with wine. You think of the way that wine has evolved. Think of the big Cabernets, big Chardonnays. The same thing happens in whisky. And one of the interesting phenomena over the past 20 years or so has been the uptake in big, heavy, smoky whiskies. Whiskies which, a few years back, the general consensus was, well, only lunatics will drink this because it's so difficult, because it's so awkward. It's wonderfully complex, but, it's a bit crazy. Rubbish. The world loves smoky whisky because the global palate has changed. And because the global palate has changed, whisky has changed with it. It's a constant story of evolution of flavour. That's where we are at the moment.